99%. By Don Cooper. Prologue. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust. Suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner, how frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors so that, in glory and triumph, they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. Carl Sagan. Introduction. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. Morpheus. How disappointingly little humanity has progressed by the 21st century that such ancient superstitions like invisible, omnipresent gods, kings, queens, and governments still populate the confines of people's minds and are worshipped and feared. All the while, as in ancient times, the priests and rulers are enriched and live like kings as the peasants pay weekly tribute to the church and state. The difference between right and wrong is a feeling. Divided up into ideological categories, women's rights, gay rights, trans rights, minority rights, elderly rights, handicapped rights rather than just human rights that apply to all humans equally. 5,000 years of recorded human history, and what's changed? Gods and magic, kings and queens, war and human sacrifice, rulers and indentured servitude, worthless money and debt. Cultural artifacts from a darker, less enlightened time that have persevered the millennia like an eradicable virus. Maybe it's because people need something to believe in that's bigger than themselves, a belief system. Belief systems are powerful, they define people, they help them cope with life and get through the day. But all belief systems are religions, superstitions, regardless if it's a belief in a god, a government authority, or something else. And to realize that your beliefs are nothing more than medieval superstitions at best, complete and utter bullshit at worst, would be to admit that your entire life has been a lie. That you have no idea who you really are or what you really believe. Such a shock to a person's mind could trigger a psychological depression so profound it could be life-threatening, so the mind fights back. It refuses to acknowledge the truth, the elephant in the room. It creates excuses for things that are so ridiculously absurd that it borders on insanity. What do you mean you can't see God? He's all around you. Really? If he's all around me, then why can't I see him? The military is in the Middle East defending your freedom. I didn't know my freedom was in the Middle East. What's it doing there? I'm writing you this speeding ticket for your own safety. Thank you, officer. Without your help I probably would have killed myself. If you don't vote, you can't complain. I can't complain about government fraud, waste, scandal, and abuse if I didn't vote for government fraud, waste, scandal and abuse. Wait, what? How about that cliched catch-all, the law is the law? What does that even mean? Red is red. See, I can say meaningless dumb shit too. But for many that meaningless cliché is so profound it defines a belief system that they live their lives by. An alternative reality they've created for themselves. I'm not a mental health professional, but that has to be a symptom of mental disorder, doesn't it? The truth is that 99% of what your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, your teachers, your preacher, your scout leader, your baseball coach, your friends, the news, social media, the internet, and anyone else has ever told you was wrong or an outright lie. Everything you thought you knew about the United States, history, education, government, voting, the police, laws, rights, crime, justice, taxes, jail, the military, wars, banks, money, language. Everything you thought defined your life and the world around you is a lie, an illusion. All part of a carefully orchestrated social indoctrination program created to perpetuate political traditions and myths and create the useful idiots that the state can control. People just smart enough to turn the wrenches and do the paperwork, but dumb enough to follow orders like obedient citizens without question. It's social engineering, and it's been so well refined over the millennia that people can be convinced they're free while being tethered securely to the state's leash. Want to drive a car, fish, hunt, buy land, build a house, own a gun, work, drink, get married, start a business, invest, adopt a child, adopt a pet, own a boat, send your kids to school, travel abroad. All the most basic of human activities requiring permission by the state, privileges given to you by the powers that be, in what they tell you is a free country. I don't think free means what people think it means. But when doubt in a belief system starts, and those first rays of reason, rational thought, logic, and common sense shine in, it quickly permeates the mind and can trigger a chain reaction. The whole house of cards begins to crumble. Every lie exposes two more lies, which in turn expose two more lies each. The destruction is exponential, like when you realized Santa Claus wasn't real. If Santa Claus is not real, then whose lap did I sit on at the mall? If the guy at the mall wasn't Santa, then how could Santa know what I want for Christmas? If Santa didn't know what I want for Christmas, how come I got everything I asked for, and who ate the goddamn cookies and drank the milk? Hard to believe at first, but true nonetheless. And Christmas was never the same after that. Your reality was altered just like that. You see the holidays completely differently, not as exciting, without the charm and enchantment. It was your first awakening. The truth is nowhere near as much fun or exciting as the illusion, that's why people like fiction. But the truth has something the illusion doesn't, it's liberating. Once you realized Santa isn't real, your parents, your teachers, and the other authority figures couldn't use it as a weapon to control you anymore. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. Jesus, who was this pervert? So much for that creepy shit. But it was the first of many lies to come, preparing your impressionable mind for your future social engineering and indoctrination. Similarly, the Founding Fathers, democracy, constitutions, country, nation, patriotism, voting, the law, foreign policy, economics, American history, money, war, all historical, cultural myths, superstitions used by the powers that be to socially engineer society into obedient lapdogs, and it works like a charm. National pride convinces people to hate those they've never met and take credit and be held responsible for things they never did. Such nationalism not only convinces young men to go to war and kill innocent people they don't know and who have never threatened them, but it has them lining up to do so and high-fiving one another when they do it. The overwhelming majority of Americans have never met an Iranian and know absolutely nothing about Iran. They couldn't even point it out on a map, yet they have been conditioned to believe that Iran poses the greatest existential threat to national security. And they would wholeheartedly, without question, support a preemptive attack on innocent Iranians if the President and Congress and American intelligence agencies said it was justified. There's a reason people avoid discussing politics, unlike any other subject. They don't avoid discussing food or travel, work, or dating. They don't avoid discussing cars or science, kids, or sports. Why is politics so different? Cognitive dissonance is the state in which one part of your mind holds a belief system to be true while at the same time your reason, rational thought, common sense, and logic tells you that it's bullshit. Your mind is literally at war with itself, and this triggers confusion, disorientation, and anger. And since every aspect of the institution of government is irrational, illogical, and doesn't make any sense, the truth will always instigate anger in the believers. People have been conditioned their entire lives to believe what the government tells them, but they don't know why. It doesn't make any sense. What's the reason, the logic? There is none. The social engineering begins before kids are even in school with Columbus Day, stories of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, 4th of July parades, Thanksgiving, Memorial Day picnics, singing God Bless America, and standing for the national anthem at sporting events. Then when they enter the government school indoctrination centers, they are marinated for 12 years in the Pledge of Allegiance, police officer friendly, revisionist history, civics, student government, the Boy Scouts, Police Explorer Scouts, and ROTC. They are taught that authority comes from the state. They are trained, like dogs, to ask permission to go to the bathroom, to stop talking when the lights are turned off, and to walk on the right-hand side of the hallway in a single file line like little soldiers. Those who obey are given gold stars, those who don't are punished. The kids are passed from one saucepan to the next with vigor and with the complete support of their patriotic parents, veterans of the indoctrination program. They are shaked and baked until they are nice and tender, perfectly distilled of all individualism and sense of self, a blank canvas for the state to create the necessary useful idiot on. Rinse and repeat. It's right around that 12th year that the military recruiters come sniffing around, whining and dining the eager, impressionable adolescent minds looking for blunt instruments ripe for military service to the empire. Dressed in pretty uniforms, adorned with shiny medals and armed with stories of God and country, national pride, heroism, and honor, that would make a schoolgirl dance and drop her pants. Who wouldn't want to be the handsome hero in a brave, romantic tale? Make your parents proud, get the girl, and save your country from evil. Marine Corps commercials even have the soldiers dressed up as medieval knights with swords that shoot lightning bolts. Wow! Where do I sign? The story conveniently leaves out the part about injury, dismemberment, and death while trying to kill people for the military-industrial complex. It ignores the PTSD, the mental health issues, the nightmares, the counseling, the drug addiction, the homelessness, the rancid conditions and care of the VA. How are you going to get the girl to dance and drop her pants when you have no arms or legs? See, it was all just a lie, a carefully planned illusion, a magic show, just another Santa Claus, all of it from school on. There is no pride or honor in nationalism, only hate, death, and destruction. Invading and occupying foreign countries is not courageous, it's criminal and terrorism. Authority doesn't come from the state. You have no obligation to a country, whatever that is. Nationalism is a religion, and like all religions it requires human sacrifice. This lifelong indoctrination program enslaves the mind and creates a very real psychological matrix among people in society. Even the most intelligent and talented people are unwittingly attached to it. They are the ones that won't cross the street unless the light is green, even if there's not a car in sight. They'll stand in the rain, the cold, the wind, the snow, suffering, staring at a light, hypnotized by it like a fish to a lure, unable to move even if they wanted to until the light turns green. When it does, it frees their mind, allowing their brain to move their muscles and cross the street. Like a dog trained to stay until his master gives him permission to come. It's as creepy as it is interesting to see how all reason, rational thought, logic, and common sense can be psychologically overridden to the point of being willing to endure physical pain rather than threaten one's belief system. Like when the military tells young soldiers that they have to go to war in a foreign country they can't spell, in a place they can't point out on a map, in order to overthrow a dictator they never heard of because he's doing things they don't understand. Don't ask why, just follow orders and arm up and go kill and risk being killed, or else you are unpatriotic, treasonous, and a bad human being, and your parents will be ashamed. Nationalism and belief in government authority is a mental disease, a fatal faith that infects the mind, for which very few survive. Most are lost forever, and their minds can never be recovered even in the face of centuries of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Their emotional and intellectual maturity retarded from an early age, socially lobotomized. They're not able to process the world around them in a rational way. They can only see the reality that's been created for them. It has a hold on their minds so tight that the absurd not only seems perfectly normal to them, but necessary, and they will become angry, even physically violent, at anyone challenging that reality. Rinse and repeat. Columbus discovered America. Education is a system of imposed ignorance. Noam Chomsky. Columbus, Ohio is named after Christopher Columbus as a monument to him and his contributions to America. As is Columbus, Georgia, Columbus, Indiana, Columbus, Illinois, and others. There are statues around the country, including a famous one in Central Park in New York City that's larger than life, idolizing his likeness. The cities, the statues, the story taught in government schools about Columbus are all meant to cultivate admiration and a romanticism for the first American. The seminal story of American exceptionalism, nationalism, and allegiance, even though it's all fabricated revisionist bullshit. Columbus set out looking for a westerly trade route to South and East Asia, which was known at the time by Europeans collectively as India. But his knowledge of the world was so bad, his navigational skills so poor, and his propensity to drink so strong, he ended up in the fucking Bahamas. Believing he had reached the East Indies, he called the newly discovered inhabitants Indians. A naming convention that remained for any and all inhabitants in Central and North America for centuries to come. Ever wonder why Native Americans were called Indians? Now you know, because of the ignorance of a 15th century drunkard who thought he was in India. I find that funny as hell. And for the love of God, can someone explain how Columbus could discover a place that already had millions of native inhabitants? I don't think discover means what they think it means. Nor did he ever once set foot on North America, but we'll just say he did, for the sake of the story. The only truly honest part about the story of Christopher Columbus is that he was Italian and had a boat. Other than that, you have to put on your boots because the shit piles up fast. It was all just made up to serve a purpose, to sell an ideology, American nationalism and exceptionalism. The lie in and of itself wouldn't be so bad if that's where it ended. It's not. Columbus enslaved, imprisoned, raped, and pillaged the locals. His actions inaugurated a period of conquest and colonization that lasted for centuries and founded the transatlantic slave trade. He tortured and oppressed the inhabitants of Hispaniola so badly that eventually the King and Queen of Spain had him arrested and imprisoned. Don't remember that part from history class, do you? That's because they never taught it. But regardless of all the bullshit surrounding the story of Columbus, all of the crap that was literally just made up as an advertising campaign, his legend grew and he is celebrated as a national hero. Columbus Day is one of only 10 federal holidays. All federal workers get the day off, as well as banks and businesses, in 23 of the U.S. states and Puerto Rico. A day off? For what? To get drunk, get lost, pick a fight with some people in another neighborhood and get arrested? Wikipedia writes, President Benjamin Harrison called upon the people of the United States to celebrate Columbus's landing in the New World on the 400th anniversary of the event. During the anniversary in 1892, teachers, preachers, poets, and politicians used rituals to teach ideals of patriotism. These rituals took themes such as citizenship boundaries, the importance of loyalty to the nation, and the celebration of social progress. You knew there had to be a political purpose to the holiday, steering society toward nationalism and the importance of loyalty to the nation. You see, all religions need gods to worship and icons to pray to. The religion of nationalism is no different. Rinse and repeat. The American Revolution. This, sir, is my great objection to the Constitution, that there is no true responsibility and that the preservation of our liberty depends on the single chance of men being virtuous enough to make laws to punish themselves. Patrick Henry. The Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War that followed, and the Constitution that created the Republic that we pledge allegiance to every morning for 12 years. The courageous founding fathers who dared to commit treason against the crown and who were willing to write a check up to and including their lives in order to secure freedom for the colonies. Also very romantic, isn't it? Most fiction is. Thomas Jefferson was one of those founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence, and like a true politician, when the British invaded, he famously scurried as quick as possible across Virginia to hide until the shooting was over and the smoke cleared. Maintaining slave plantations in Montebello and Lynchburg, VA, the man who just signed a document declaring all men are equal unless you were black, Native American, or female ran like a coward to hide. I don't think equal means what Jefferson thought it meant. Benjamin Franklin also committed treason against the crown by signing the Declaration, but of course he was too old and fragile to fight, so he sat this one out as well in France. Remember the story of how Franklin supposedly tied a key to a kite and discovered electricity? Speculation on the electrical properties of lightning had been the issue of scientific debate by Jean-Antoine Nollet, Denis Barbarat, Jacques Derômes, and others as early as 1749. At that time Franklin was in opposition to the theory altogether. He later changed his mind and had proposed an experiment with conductive rods, but there is no record of him conducting any such experiments. But it sure made for a nice story in school, didn't it? John Adams, another founding father and signer of the Declaration, did not fight. James Madison was a frail man of little stature who also decided that discretion was the better part of valor. It would seem it also gets a university named after you. John Hancock, Samuel Adams the same. I mean, come on. Hancock was much too valuable as a political advisor to soil his hands with such proletariat activities like fighting a war he started. That's what ordinary men are for. War has always been old men sending young men to die. This one was no different. 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence, few actually picked up arms against the British and, except for George Washington, none of the founding fathers we are taught about in school did so. I guess their checkbooks didn't have any checks left in them. Don't you hate it when that happens? What the founding fathers did do was to thrust almost 3 million colonists into a war against the world's most powerful military, whether they liked it or not. The majority of the colonists were farmers, simple people who had no problem being British subjects and had no interest in going to war against the British. But that didn't matter. If they didn't volunteer to fight, they were conscripted, and if they refused to fight, they were labeled deserters and shot as ordered by Washington. They didn't teach you about Washington's firing squads murdering conscripted farmers because they didn't want to fight in his war, did they? I don't think freedom means what Washington thought it meant. The truth is that the founding fathers were by and large men of significant means compared to the rest of the colonists. Means that were being taxed by King George and that didn't sit well with them, so they decided to liberate themselves and their means from British rule. But they couldn't do it with their ragtag army and state militias, so they sent Ben Franklin to France to charm King Louis XVI and convince him and King Carlos II of Spain to come and overthrow the British government in the colonies for them. It was a foreign coup, regime change, i.e., not a revolution. That's right, there never was an American Revolution. It was all just fairy tales made up from perverted historical pieces created as part of an indoctrination campaign. It was nothing more than a foreign military operation for international political expedience. Mind blown, right? Nor was there independence for the colonists. The founding fathers immediately took control of the colonial government and instituted their own set of laws, taxes, and punishments for disobeying them. George Washington even insisted on being referred to as His Excellency. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The colonists traded one despot across the ocean for a government full of despots across the colonies. In 1787, in violation of the Articles of Confederation, they met in secret in Philadelphia to write a new constitution centralizing power on themselves, which included the Bill of Rights. Soon after, in 1798, President John Adams, in direct violation of the First Amendment he had just signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law, making it a federal crime to criticize the government. I don't think freedom of speech means what Adams thought it meant. I just laugh when I hear about Independence Day in the United States. Independence from what? Freedom. I don't think independence means what people think it means either. America was never great, how could it be? The Founding Fathers were all rich, white slave owners who colonized Native Americans and subjugated women. They were some of the worst of humanity. Then the politicians used things like Manifest Destiny to justify stealing millions of square acres of land from the Mexicans and killing anyone who got in their way. The USA was built on the back of slave labor, colonization, genocide, murder, theft, and abuse. Nothing great about that. What you're taught in government schools is all just part of the illusion created for your mind's consumption. Eat up. Rinse and repeat. The Civil War. Good people will do their best, bad people will do their worst, but if you want good people to do their worst, you're going to need government. Christopher Hitchens. Can you imagine visiting your brother at his home one day, having dinner with him and his family, and then trying to kill him the next day for no reason other than someone, a stranger at that, from the government told you to? And when you ask why, you're told because he lives on the other side of an invisible political line called a border and the government has decided to war with those people over there. Having chosen to live on that side of the line years before makes your brother an enemy of the state. Refusing to engage him in battle will be seen as treason, punishable by death. Did you get all that? Agree to go to try and kill your brother or we'll kill you. That was what the history books call the Civil War. If you think it sounds insane, you're correct. It's more of the worst of humanity. Good people who had nothing against one another going to war because they were more afraid of what the government would do to them than they were of being killed on the battlefield. At least on the battlefield they stood a chance. Like the imaginary Revolutionary War, there never was a civil war either. Government school revisionist history calls it a civil war in an effort to deflect blame away from Abraham Lincoln and the state and make it appear that Americans were mad at each other and decided to attack one another because they had nothing better to do, I guess. Specifically, that the Americans in the northern states were humble, peace-loving, God-fearing Americans who wanted to end slavery, and those in the South were racist, evil, slave owners who wanted to keep their slaves. You ready for this? The Civil War had nothing to do with ending slavery. In a letter to Horace Greeley, Lincoln famously wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." Abraham Lincoln 1862. Another lie down the drain. Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He was a politician like every politician in the history of politics, and every decision he made was for political expedience and to maximize his political capital. The concept of a socially conscious president is all just part of the program. Lincoln also considered exporting former slaves to British colonies in the Caribbean after the war. They did what they called a test by exporting 450 former slaves. I don't think former slaves means what they thought it meant to Haiti, where most died of smallpox and starvation. The truth about what history calls the Civil War is that it was the United States of America's first international war of aggression. A number of the state governments decided to declare their independence from the United States of America and create a new country called the Confederated States of America. Just like the Founding Fathers did in 1776 when they declared their independence from King George. And just like King George, Lincoln didn't like it, so he declared war against them. Rinse and repeat. Starting to see a pattern in government behavior regardless which government it is. Democracy. Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. Benjamin Franklin. Democracy is the great lie, the modern-day illusion that convinces people that they are the government. I don't know many people who live as well as the politicians do, with high six-figure salaries, bodyguards, Cadillac healthcare, flying for free, and pensions for life. The illusion of democracy was a stroke of genius for the ancient Greek politicians who created it. It convinces the people that if the government doesn't do what they want it to do, or if the government abuses them, they have no one to blame but themselves, since they are the government. It's a multiple personality disorder, and it's evident in how politicians disassociate themselves from the government when they talk. Members of Congress, who are part of the government, routinely talk about the government in the third person. The government this and the government that. As if they had nothing to do with the tax increases, the bombing of the Afghanistan wedding, or the arrest of the octogenarian who was feeding the homeless. It was the people's will that did that. The people are the government. That shit is priceless no matter how you slice it. Give credit where credit is due. The state is genius-level social engineering. Although the concept of democracy has existed for over 2,000 years, the last 2 millennia were still riddled with kings and queens, despots and dictates, oligarchies and rulers, socialism, fascism, Nazism, and communism. Each form of government successively convincing the masses that it was the next greatest thing since sliced bread, and humanity had to have it for a civilized society. Because this time all of society's problems would be solved, this time the rich would get theirs, this time the working man would be rewarded. This time, promise. Like a used car salesman year after year successfully convincing his customers that this year's model is a must-have for the discriminating buyer. Just look how it shines. Those sleek lines, the smooth curves, and all modern features. He hypnotizes with charisma, charm, and sexy buzzwords like fully loaded, supple features, and no extra charge. The buyer gets way up in his head, already imagining a future that hasn't happened yet. The heads he'll turn with this car. The respect he'll earn. The chicks he'll get. Shit, the poor schlep never stood a chance. He's been looking for the difference maker in his life, the one thing that would change it all, and now he's found it. When in truth it's nothing more than just another piece of shit used car all dressed to impress. And a used car doesn't make the man, it doesn't earn respect or get the girl, not a girl worth getting anyway. But goddamn if it didn't seem like a good idea at the time. Rinse and repeat. Enter the 21st century's newest used model, constitutional democracy. Just look how it shines. All modern features and a constitution, no extra charge. The salesmen hypnotize you with buzzwords like freedom and liberty, the people and voting, justice and rights, national pride and exceptionalism. How could anyone not be attracted to that? What are you, a communist? In theory, a constitutional democracy is a democratically elected representative government, but the government is constrained by a constitution. A constitution being the rule of law, the fundamental law defining and limiting government authority. All government legislation should be able to be traced back to its authority in the Constitution. In practice, a constitution is a piece of paper that has no authority, no rights, and certainly no power to constrain the acts of wicked men. But whether the constitution really be one thing, or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case it is unfit to exist. Lysander Spooner. And where did the Constitution come from? God. Magical nymphs? The Big Bang? It was written in secret by those it's meant to constrain, the government. It's meant to constrain the government that wrote the document that constrains it. I wonder how limited my governing powers would be if I wrote the document limiting my powers. Nice work if you can get it, I suppose. Consider the fact that the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, although the Constitution bestows the authority to create the Supreme Court and nowhere bestows the authority to interpret it. How can a document that creates the government also be written by that government limit the power of that government when that same government interprets the document's meaning? Is your mind blown yet? It should be, because it's all legal mumbo-jumbo, logically contradictory bullshit, never doubt it. The Mickey Mouse Club pledge has as much relevance when it comes to the legitimacy of and constraining the power of government. Some people like to proclaim that a constitutional democracy is really a republic. As if calling it a republic sanitizes it somehow and makes it morally superior. They conveniently ignore that some of the most horrendous government regimes in human history were republics. The USSR was a republic, so was East Germany, as is China and North Korea. Calling it a republic is irrelevant, it's just lipstick on a pig. Ever wonder why, if the role of government is to protect our rights, why a Bill of Rights is needed in the Constitution to protect our rights from the government? I'll just leave that right there. In reality, the Constitution functions as a convenient political excuse for government actions when needed, and it's ignored altogether when it's not. It's just a piece of paper. It does nothing, it has no power, no authority. It grants no authority, it delegates nothing and limits nothing. You know why? Because it's a piece of paper. You know how much power and authority the Constitution has? A child can easily wad it up and throw it away. You know why? Because it's a piece of paper. The Constitution is the illusion that is used to control people and convince them they are responsible for things they had nothing to do with. So if you voted those in power into office and they do bad things, then you are responsible. You could have chosen someone else to represent you, but you didn't. You need to vote better next time. After all, you are the government. Rinse and repeat. Voting. If voting changed anything, it'd be illegal. Emma Goldman. Voting takes the power from the government and puts it in the hands of the people, right? No, but thanks for playing. Voting is the carrot in front of the jackass's nose pulling the wagon of ignorance. It's the illusion that your voice matters. It doesn't. It's the illusion that the government is the people. It's not. What's called voting isn't voting at all. It's the government asking for your preference as to which one of their guys you prefer, and maybe they'll take your preference into consideration, but probably not. First of all is the arithmetic, it just doesn't add up. The only vote that matters is the deciding vote, and you have a better chance of winning the lottery multiple times than your vote being the decider. Let's say 10 people are voting on something and 9 vote in favor and 1 opposed. What if the 1 opposed didn't vote at all? Would it change the outcome? No. What if 7 out of the 9 that voted in favor didn't vote? Would that change the outcome? No. Now multiply everything by millions and you see your vote simply doesn't matter, regardless what a lifetime of political rhetoric has convinced you. You're a single voice screaming in a crowd of millions and nobody can hear you, nor would it matter if they could. Secondly is the bias associated with any election. The election is organized, implemented, and the votes counted by the same people you're voting for. What could go wrong? You can only vote on the day you are told, at the location you are given, for the candidates and issues you are presented with. Hardly a free and fair vote now, is it? This doesn't take into account voter fraud, which is rampant in any election, and the legal shenanigans in counting the votes and announcing the results. Like in the 2000 presidential election, when the governor of Florida announced the winner before the votes were even finished being counted. And regardless how much voter fraud is verified, what legal shenanigans are exposed, or how few people vote, there will always be a winner declared. In every election for the last 50 years there has been voter fraud, election irregularities, and only about half the voting age population voted, meaning no one has ever gotten a majority of the votes, ever. Yet someone is always declared the winner. Seems that the voter fraud alone should disqualify the election, but nope. Seems any election improprieties should too, but nope. Seems when half the population votes none of the above, that would disqualify the election as well, but nope. The government must go on at all costs, even at the cost of our freedom. We're told that society has to be governed because individuals aren't capable of governing themselves. But somehow some of those that aren't capable of governing themselves are capable of governing everyone? And the rest of those who aren't capable of governing themselves are capable of deciding which among them is capable of governing everyone? Where's the sense in any of that? Ask someone why they voted for Barack Obama and they're likely to say because he's black, a racial decision. Ask someone why they voted for Hillary and they're likely to say because she is a woman, a feminine decision. Ask someone why they voted for Trump and they're likely to say because he's a businessman, a business decision. Voter preferences are arbitrary nonsense. Comedian Joe Stanhope said he voted for Gary Johnson because he follows him on Twitter. There's no reason, rational thought, logic, or common sense to voter preferences, so what's the point? Lastly is the morality of voting. If something is immoral before a vote is taken, the vote doesn't magically make it moral and okay. Imagine a pretty girl walking down the sidewalk. Obviously it's wrong, immoral for a gang of men to rape her. But what if they vote on it? What if a majority of the men vote to jump her? Does it make it okay, moral? No, of course not. A majority vote is just the majority violating the rights of the minority, enslaving the minority to their will. But the supposed greatness of democracy is founded in this idea of majority rule. It says nothing about the morality of what the majority wants. It never considers the rights of the minority. Government is considered a necessary evil without ever acknowledging that it's still an evil. It's nothing more than mob rule writ large. A lot of people like to try and excuse and justify voting by saying that if you don't vote then you can't complain about what the politicians do. Think about how utterly childish and ignorant that sentiment is. So if I didn't vote in the Gambino family elections for mob boss, I can't complain when they extort my neighborhood for protection money. Now replace Gambino family with government, mob boss with president, and extort with tax and you see my point. If I didn't vote for any of the politicians in the government because I didn't want anyone ruling me and those politicians decide to raise taxes, again, I can't complain about that. How is it I can't complain about a bunch of complete strangers with a long and dubious history of fraud, waste, scandal, and abuse who I want nothing to do with, forcing their will on me? How is that any different than the Gambino family? I specifically made it clear I didn't want anything to do with them by not participating in their mob-like elections. I made it clear I wanted them to just leave me alone. The voters are the ones who asked for it and they got it. The voters are the ones who have no right to complain. They got exactly what they voted for. The truth is that those who don't vote are in fact voting, they're just not voting at the ballot box. They're voting with their absence from it. They are voting for none of the above, they are voting for no one. They refuse to vote for the lesser of two evils because it's still an evil. They refuse to accept that government is a necessary evil, evil is never necessary. But the election boards don't count the votes for no one because they're not official. There is no option on the ballot for no one, so the will of those people can simply be ignored even though no one has been the clear winner in every presidential election in my lifetime. All just part of the illusion. If a politician does something that you agree with then it's by coincidence not by design. His first allegiance is to the party, the state, and his political capital. Voters are just the excuse for what they do, not the reason. So if you're mad again about the lying, corrupt politicians in office and think voting for new people is the solution, then ask yourself how did those lying, corrupt politicians that you want out get in there in the first place? If you're honest, the answer is voting. Rinse and repeat. Candidates. I just grab them by the pussy. Presidential candidate Donald Trump. Any real job requires certain qualifications. Not just anyone can be an engineer, doctor, plumber, or mechanic. Even an entry-level job requires certain basic physical and mental abilities as well as a sense of responsibility. And if hired, there are certain expectations of an employee regarding conduct, professionalism, and integrity on the job. Being a member of Congress, President, or the Supreme Court requires no qualifications whatsoever. I'll say that again in case you thought you read it wrong. Being a member of Congress, President, or the Supreme Court requires no qualifications whatsoever. There are no educational qualifications required, no work experience required, no references from previous employers, no physical requirements, no drug test, no credit check, no background investigation, absolutely nothing. All a candidate has to do is win a popularity contest, like the prom queen. There are no resumes presented, no interviews conducted, no salary negotiations, no internal discussions on which candidate is most qualified and would make a good addition to the organization. There are no performance evaluations, just get the most votes and you're hired, guaranteed for at least 4 years. It's magical. You don't even have to have a law degree or be an attorney or have ever done anything related to the law to be on the Supreme Court. The highest court in the land. The decisions of which affect 320 million people's lives? Let that soak in for a moment. That's like not requiring a medical degree or medical experience before operating on a patient. Remember when G.W. Bush tried to nominate his cleaning lady? And a political candidate can promise anything he wants during his campaign, ice cream and a pony for everyone, but he is under absolutely no obligation to honor his promises if elected. And there are no consequences when he doesn't, so he can't be fired for lying. Integrity is also not a requirement to be a member of Congress, President, or the Supreme Court. If elected, a member of Congress doesn't even have to show up for work. We've all seen the empty congressional chambers on C-SPAN over the years, congressmen giving lengthy speeches to empty chairs. These representatives are infamous for sending their staffers to vote in their stead, sometimes one staffer casting votes for multiple congressmen at the same time. I mean, they can't be bothered with such petty tasks when they are on the back nine with a lobbyist negotiating a deal. So what do these arbitrary nobodies receive for being members of Congress? A starting salary of $174,000 per year, a $2 million expense budget, Cadillac health insurance, Secret Service protection, free transportation, and a pension for life. They live far, far above the standard of living of the productive people running the economy that they are supposed to represent, and yet they do nothing, they produce nothing. They consume. They are parasites on the back of humanity. The great thing about a democracy is that anyone can rule. The worst thing about a democracy is that anyone can rule. Year after year people complain about their elected officials. Why, when they are the ones who elected the completely unqualified people in the first place? What a joke representative democracy is. Rinse and repeat. Authority. As soon as we abandon our own reason, and are content to rely upon authority, there is no end to our troubles. Bertrand Russell. Children are indoctrinated from their earliest conscience moments that authority comes from the state. Their parents, family members, teachers, and other adults they look up to all refer to those in government as the authorities. The authorities have issued a curfew, authorities are on the lookout for a man, authorities say that. From the start their minds are impressed with the idea that they need authorization from the state, but where does this supposed authority really come from? The politicians will tell you that voting authorizes the government to do what it does. That their authority comes from the people. But how do the people give politicians authority they don't have to give in the first place? Nobody has authority to impose a tax on their neighbors every month with the excuse that it's for the benefit of the community or public affairs. To insist that they pay their fair share, and if they refuse, to send men with guns to collect. That's extortion. Armed robbery by definition. But if someone wins an election and becomes a member of the city council, state legislature, or Congress, now they somehow have the authority to do exactly those sorts of things. Where did this authority magically come from? Thin air? The other side of the rainbow? God. Nobody has such authority over others regardless what their excuse for claiming it is. Those are just more mob tactics. The mob is infamous for collecting protection money from the community to protect the community. And if you refuse to pay your fair share they can't guarantee your protection, namely from them. The idea of the government's authority coming from the people takes a turn for the dark side when it comes to war. Murder is immoral and wrong, unless the state does it lawfully. Unless the state decides that killing is okay in the name of national security, whatever they decide that means. but it's really the people who are waging the war, the people are responsible for it, the people authorized it because they voted for the representatives who speak for them. So it's the same as if the people made the decision themselves to bomb Pakistan with remote-controlled drones. If you're going to be mad at anybody about the drone accidentally bombing a Doctors Without Borders hospital and killing everyone in it, then you should be mad at yourself. After all, the democratically elected official that you voted for had his staffer vote yes on your behalf while he was on the back nine. You can hardly hold him responsible for the collateral damage. He wasn't even there. See how sophisticatedly all the pieces fit together in a psychological matrix of romantic fables, clever misdirection, professional sophistry, and outright lies to create the desired nationalism and obedience to authority. A reality created specifically for you and continuously injected into your mind like a saline drip almost from birth. It's a part of you now, like a birth defect that everyone pretends looks good on you, but in truth it's your ugliest feature and for which the truth is the only cure. You don't even know it's there anymore, but it rears its ugly head every time someone asks you a question and your response begins with legally. Rinse and repeat. The truth is there is no such thing as government authority. It's an illusion. The only authority the state has resides at the end of the barrel of a gun. Ask any exiled despot if his authority was real or just a myth, a superstition that only lasted as long as his generals said it did. Legitimate authority comes from rights, and a government has no rights, individuals have rights. That's not to say there aren't those who will try and violate a person's rights and challenge his authority over his life, but this is the exception, not the rule. Criminals exist, and it's by acknowledging individual rights, self-ownership, and legitimate authority of the individual that we can identify the criminals. It's by acknowledging individual rights, self-ownership, and legitimate authority that we can build businesses and employ and produce and trade and invent and innovate. It's how economic progress is made and humanity evolves. Illegitimate authority of the state is the rule, not the exception. Ask yourself if you would voluntarily continue to pay taxes, fees, licenses, permits, etc. if they were not backed by the very real threat of state force for non-compliance. If the state said you could opt out of all their laws and regulations, nobody in their right mind would give almost 40% or their income or more to the lying, conniving, manipulating politicians to waste if they weren't forced to, because the truth is that nobody in their right mind recognizes the state's authority to be legitimate. Not even those who say they do. Does your boss have to carry a gun and threaten you with handcuffs, a taser, a beating, imprisonment, or death in order to get you to do your job, pay your share of the water cooler, or obey the rules of conduct in the office? Of course not. You recognize and respect his authority as the boss to make the daily business decisions regarding work schedules and tasks. If at any time he feels you're not fulfilling his expectations, he can fire you. If at any time you feel he's a dick and the job sucks, you can quit and look for work elsewhere. Nobody gets tossed or beat down because they were rude or disrespectful. Nobody dies for something as benign as refusing to show ID. See how legitimate authority works? It's a voluntary association. Government authority is nothing but force, period, you have no choice. And it is that continuous, very real threat of force that invalidates their claim to authority at all. Billions of people on the planet go to work every day, interact with each other respectfully and peacefully in millions of different ways, and acknowledge and respect the rights and authority of others. They do this not because of the government but despite it. Acknowledgement of and respect for legitimate authority is the foundation of all economic progress and peace. Government authority is the illusion that consumes an economy's productivity, any chance for peace and people's souls. Language. The misuse of language induces evil in the soul. Socrates. Language is a powerful tool for controlling people. Every effective despot, dictator, warlord, and clergyman in history was an effective orator who could use language to inspire and motivate. They understood that language can be used to influence people's minds and beliefs. In the wrong hands, it can convince people that wrong is right, war is peace, and having rulers is the price we pay for a civilized society. Politicians and the body politic are masters at manipulating language to their advantage in a number of different ways, and children are conditioned with these linguistic gymnastics in government schools from the very start. Over the millennia, those who write the dictionaries and print the news, the authoritative sources for language and the definition of words, have succumbed to the pressure and influence of the state. Words have evolved to justify and legitimize government crime and to criminalize and punish innocent people of crimes they didn't commit. This perversion of language plays an integral role in creating the necessary illusion and alternative reality defined by men and what they say is lawful rather than what is right as defined by morality and individual rights. Remember, slavery was the lawful owning of black people, so it wasn't kidnapping and enslavement, it was legalized indentured servitude. How easy it is for the state to manipulate language to pervert reality to its liking. I think most would agree that a fair understanding of stealing is taking something that doesn't belong to you without the owner's permission. Pretty simple, even children know what it means to steal. If you refer to just about any dictionary or online resource, it will tell you that it's the unlawful taking of something that doesn't belong to you without the owner's permission. The meaning conveniently massaged to excuse stealing on the part of the state, effectively giving it a linguistic monopoly on crime that justifies the practical monopoly. Cops can steal your car, your money, your belongings from you right on the side of the road, since asset forfeiture is lawful, even if you've been charged with nothing. So it's not stealing, it's enforcing the law. Voila! See how the illusion works? Assault, as you'd expect, is defined as the unlawful touching or attack using personal violence. Most definitions you find for assault will also use the word in a sentence referencing a police officer. He pleaded guilty to assaulting a police officer, subliminally implanting the notion that touching or use of violence of any kind, even in self-defense, against a police officer is a crime. Moving right along. Murder is the unlawful killing of another human without justification or valid excuse, especially the unlawful killing of another human being with malice aforethought, premeditated. Notice again how the state excuses its actions. Cops can murder people on the street, but since it was decided that it was a lawful shooting, it's not murder. The cop was just doing his job and he followed proper police procedure. Are we seeing a pattern yet? At the same time, the meaning of non-criminal activities have been criminalized. Fraud is simply deceiving someone for whatever reason. Whether it be something as simple as lying or running a con game, neither of which is an actual crime since no force was used, no rights were violated. Nobody has a right not to be lied to or not to be suckered. But over time the definition has become the deliberate deception to secure unfair or unlawful gain. Fraud criminalizes lying, condemning all of humanity to a life of crime, and at the same time excuses the state from the same consequences of their long and dubious history of lying and fraud that they've imposed on society. Because sometimes the people have to be lied to for matters of national security and for the children. Voila! Easy peasy, Japanesey. And when the state accuses someone of a non-crime where there's no rights violation, i.e., no victim, they have to invent a victim, a strawman to stand in as the accuser. They call it the state or the people, as if strawmen can be anthropomorphized into real people who have rights and can be wronged. It's no different than the Santa Claus myth, another imaginary being watching over you and punishing you if don't behave. Remember how liberating it was when you learned the truth that Santa wasn't real? Just let that shit go. The political use of language becomes comically insane when politicians use euphemisms and intentional ambiguity to describe and ostensibly justify their unethical and immoral behavior in order to keep the sheep coming back for more. What George Orwell called doublespeak in 1949 when he wrote the book 1984. Language that deliberately obscures, disguises, distorts, or reverses the meaning of words. The senator didn't funnel taxpayer money through an offshore shell company to his re-election campaign fund, the money was somehow misappropriated. The congresswoman didn't lie to the voters, she misremembered when she said she had to dodge rebel gunfire on a diplomatic mission to Serbia. Even though a CBS camera crew was with her on the trip and has video of the whole thing, she swears that's not how she remembers it. The vice president didn't approve million-dollar bailouts to corporate CEOs who financed his campaign. His staffers misinterpreted his instructions and they erroneously put that language in the bill. Oh well, too late now, what are you going to do? The military didn't commit international terrorism when they invaded and overthrew another country's government, killing thousands of innocent people. They were a force for good and implemented regime change in order to spread democracy even if it killed the indigenous population. Sound familiar? Rinse and repeat. There are certain nationalistic expressions that we've been conditioned to respond to which are meant to convince people they're responsible for things they had nothing to do with, in yet another attempt to deflect responsibility from those with the dirty hands to the people. I don't know why there even is a government. They don't seem to be responsible for doing anything. How often have we heard a news report claim that the US did this or the US did that? As if we're all in this together, so whatever a handful of people in the government does, all 320 million Americans are responsible for it. Or your taxes, as if you own and are responsible for something the government forces on you. The use of the definitive article the when referring to their laws. The law, as if it is the one, mighty, all-power law that must be obeyed. Reminds me of the great and powerful ounce, all just an illusion meant to intimidate and subjugate. Politicians are experts at using language to dig the social rabbit hole and psychologically push people down it. They twist reality and convince good people they are bad while at the same time justifying their own criminal actions. I promise you it's all an illusion. Always has been, always will be. Rights. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Nelson Mandela. There's no such thing as women's rights or handicapped rights, gay rights, or elderly rights, LGBTXYZ rights, or minority rights of any kind. There are only human rights and we're all human. To believe that rights depend on a social distinction is to believe that rights are not equal for everyone. It's to believe that if you are randomly born a woman you have rights that men don't. We all have the exact same rights, the right to our life, our body, our labor, and the wealth they create. We have the right to exercise our free will as sentient human beings. Those trying to erroneously divide rights up into ideological party joints to be passed around the room are trying to get society high on victimization so they won't notice them working the politicians over for special legal privilege, legal rights. They want laws passed and enforced on everyone that give them special consideration in society, at work and, of course, more money and feigned respect. They are the cultural Marxists who march topless in the streets or dressed as vaginas shouting equality and compassion while pursuing privilege with force. I don't think equality and compassion mean what they think it means. There's no such thing as a legal right, it's an oxymoron like free state or sovereign citizen. It's government doublespeak meant to obscure and distort the meaning of the concept and excuse what the state does. They're trying to convince you that they have the right to do something that they do not. Whenever the state wants to do something that violates the rights of others, they just write some new laws and claim the legal right to do it. How convenient. But rights do not come from the government and their laws or from a constitution. Government judges do not determine the rights of others, how can they? That would imply that judges have rights the rest of us don't, they do not. If rights were to come from the state then they wouldn't be rights at all but privileges. Privileges can be taken away, rights cannot. Slaves are given privileges by their masters, free people are not. Individuals have rights, straw men do not. The state has no rights, the people has no rights, Uncle Sam isn't real and has no rights. They are political aberrations magically conjured into existence like a 5,000-year-old Egyptian priestess, anthropomorphized in order to facilitate the implementation of the government's nefarious ways. The state magically turns rights into privileges and punishes those who abuse the privileges the state was so kind to give them. Don't be angry about the privileges the state has given you, be thankful for what the state hasn't done to you yet. Human rights come from our humanity, our reason, rational thought, logic, common sense, and our conscience. Economically, We reason that we're better off as individuals if we acknowledge and respect the property rights of others and trade with them rather than if we engage in perpetual war. We can engage in invention and innovation working together peacefully. We can progress as a society and achieve things that were previously thought unachievable. Individuals learned how to fly and invented the light bulb, the internal combustion engine, and the semiconductor. They did this by voluntarily working together, not because of government-imposed legal rights but despite them. Empathetically, our conscience punishes us with guilt when we violate the rights of others. That's why the truth is so liberating, it lifts the burden of guilt from a person's conscience. Emotionally, we understand we're better off as individuals if we acknowledge and respect those rights. Human rights are natural and unalienable, and they begin with self-ownership and self-determination. Rights are those things which require consent on the part of the individual, the right to one's body and life and free will. Each individual has the right to determine what they do with their body, their life, and what path they take. They require no one's permission to exist, to live, to pursue whatever they want in life. Everyone has the right to put anything in their body they want, tattoo it, pierce it, mutilate it, or even end it. They have the right to sell their body, their labor, and their skills to the highest bidder for money. They have the right to use that money for anything they want, even sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Anyone telling you otherwise and using force to violate those rights is committing a crime regardless of who it is. If it's wrong for you to do it, then it's wrong for everyone to do it. Rights are not conditional. Human rights are objective, they are the same for everyone. Find even one person on the planet who doesn't assert that their consent is required for sex with them. Even one person who doesn't believe in self-ownership and the right to self-determination from which all other rights originate. From which all human interactions, all production, all trade arises. I'll be waiting over here because that person doesn't exist. Even the mentally handicapped fight back when attacked. Why? If they don't instinctually know they have a right to their body and their life. The acknowledgement of and respect for rights are the foundation of all human relationships, both personal and economic. Without property rights there'd be no production, no trade, no innovation, no invention. Why incur the costs and risks of being productive when you can just take what you want from those smaller and weaker, since they have no rights to it in the first place? But although there are some in any society who will violate the rights of others, i.e., the criminals, the overwhelming majority of the world are civilized, moral people going to work every day because they acknowledge and respect the rights of others and their employer. Otherwise, why would they go to work? Why would anyone pay for something at the store if they didn't acknowledge and respect the store owner's right to it? A civilized man acknowledges and respects the rights of others. An uncivilized man violates the rights of others. He's called a criminal. The former facilitates production and trade and peace, and the latter allows us to identify who the criminals are and weed them out. The existence of rights doesn't preclude crime, it in fact defines it. A crime is the intentional violation of a right, a wrong. Taking something that doesn't belong to you without the owner's permission, regardless of who the perpetrator is, regardless of who he works for, regardless of what he's been told or what he believes. Government laws and their pretty little badges don't magically create rights the rest of us don't have, they don't turn a wrong into a right, they don't justify legalized crime. Rinse and repeat. The law. We have nothing to do with the laws, it's the voters whose expectations we have to fulfill. EU Foreign Minister. Who hasn't been on the receiving end of the tired old platitude, the law is the law? Like a quote from one of many science fiction movies like Judge Dredd or The Hunger Games, where there's one authoritative source of right and wrong, acceptable social behavior, and a ruling elite who judge, and they call it the law. Very serious and important sounding, isn't it? There's no such thing as the law. It's just another illusion magically created in the state's social engineering lab to instill fear and compliance. In nature there are many laws, and they are things that are a natural part of the physical world around us, so they must be obeyed, we have no choice. They are the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, the law of aerodynamics, and any other natural phenomenon that have been discovered to be a part of the world around us. These natural laws enforce themselves without prejudice or compassion. Jump off a roof and gravity will laugh at you when you bust your ass on the ground. Get enough air speed and lift will be created under a wing. Open an oven and the heat will come rushing out. What the government calls laws are not laws at all. They are not a natural part of the world around us, they do not have to be obeyed, that's why they require third-party enforcement with guns. There's one certain way to tell if something is a law or not. If it requires enforcement with guys with guns, it's not a law, it's just somebody's rules that they want to force you to obey. Government laws are nothing but the will of politicians, influenced by political bribery. They are irrelevant, a fantasy land created by the worst of humanity to control people and enrich themselves. The government calls their rules laws in order to give the psychological impression that they are unquestionable, you must obey them, that you have no choice. That they are as natural a part of life as gravity, they're not. Their laws are just words on a piece of paper that the government wants you to obey for no reason other than they say so. The politicians write them and then pass them down to the enforcers to force on you without prejudice or compassion. They'll tell you that they are our laws as if we the people wrote them, everybody agreed upon them, so you must obey them or else you are going against the will of the people. I don't know anyone who ever wrote a single law. I don't know anyone who knows anyone who ever wrote a single law. I don't think our laws means what they think it means. Some will argue that government laws are the price we pay for a civilized society. As if the will of politicians, complete strangers with a long and dubious history of lying, conniving, and corruption can determine the morality of the man. A moral man is a moral man despite the government's laws, not because of them. An immoral man is an immoral man regardless of the government's laws. In either case, their laws have nothing to do with a civilized society, the people do. The morally bankrupt who turns to the government's laws for his moral compass is a dangerous man and not a man to be trusted. He's the man who would have returned runaway slaves to their rightful owners because it was the law. Even if it meant he had to injure or kill the slave in order to do so. The law is the law. He's the man who would have called the police on his neighbor for drinking a beer during Prohibition because it was the law. Even if it meant his peaceful, hard-working neighbor went to jail, lost his job and family because of it. The law is the law. He's the one who would have called the police on Rosa Parks for sitting in the front of the bus because it was Jim Crow law. Those Negroes ought to know their place. The law is the law. Everything the communists did was the law, everything the Nazis did was the law, slavery was the law. Every egregious act any state has ever committed against mankind was the law. What in God's name do the government's laws have to do with anything moral, decent, humane, or just? And if it's not moral, decent, humane, or just, why do we care? It's irrelevant. Some will argue that the government's laws protect you. Seems to me that rape, stealing, and murder have been against the law for a long, long time, and yet the USA is one of the most crime-ridden countries on the planet in all three categories. Don't take my word for it though, test it for yourself. The next time someone tries to rob or rape you, show them the law and see if the criminal changes his mind, apologizes, and leaves. Depending on the law to protect you will get you killed. In all cases the government's laws turn good people into criminals, create more crime, or their enforcement is the crime. Prohibition laws of the 1920s turned good people who just wanted to drink a beer into criminals and created the organized crime of the era. Organized crime only exists to provide what the government prohibits, and it created Al Capone, Joe Bonanno, and Vincent Mad Dog Coll and all the violence that came with them. All the while politicians were drinking all the alcohol they wanted right in Washington, D.C. Prohibition lasted until 1933. A decade of crime, destruction, and governmental abuse of peaceful people. Prohibition made criminals of good people, rich men of criminals, while the politicians lived the high life off of bribes from the mob bosses they created. How very civilized indeed. Rinse and repeat. The government's laws are nothing but a legal form of extortion, theft, and control. Consider one of the most egregious violations of one's most basic human rights, DUI laws. DUI laws, and all prior restraint laws, are an exercise in mental idiocy and ignorance, and the useful idiots and programmable tools act as if it makes perfect sense. First is the most glaring fact about drinking and driving. Tens of millions of people drink and drive every day, even more on the weekends, and yet they get home just fine. More people die every year from diarrhea and the common flu than car accidents of any kind. Secondly is the fallacy of correlation and causation. If someone has BAC of 0.00 and causes an accident, then they look for any other reason to blame the accident on. If he has BAC of 0.08 or more, then any further examination is immediately abandoned and the cause of the accident is determined to be alcohol, whether that's true or not. This conveniently and erroneously stacks the stats in favor of DUI laws. Thirdly is the fallacy of guilt by association. Someone in the past caused an accident after drinking, therefore if you drink you too will cause an accident. One person's actions have absolutely nothing to do with anybody else's. The most nefarious aspect about such laws is that they punish people for doing something wrong before they've done anything wrong, with the justification that it will prevent them from doing something wrong. It's pre-crime as depicted in the film Minority Report. Think about that shit for a minute. Government laws resemble science fiction. The BAC is an arbitrary value that has changed many times over the years at the whims of the bureaucrats. And yet these laws for doing nothing wrong can and do ruin people's lives every day. Are you seeing how the government's laws civilize society yet? What am I missing? Law enforcement. Every law, no matter how trivial, is backed by the very real threat of death. Anonymous. Since government laws are not laws at all but just rules, they need enforcement, and for that there are armed government law enforcers. These people run in packs and are armed with clubs, tasers, guns, and handcuffs, and they do exactly what the title implies: they enforce the government's laws. They enforce them without question, prejudice, or compassion, even if they violate your rights, even if it's a crime to do so. Remember, the law is the law, it's above your humanity, and the cop is just doing his job, so he's not responsible for what he does to you. And the politicians are not responsible for the laws, they're just fulfilling the expectations of the voters, so you have no one to blame but yourself for the $150 speeding ticket. You should have expected it, after all you voted for it. The government and their enforcers had nothing to do with it. It's the will of the people in your constitutional democracy. See how the political bullshit and misdirection circles back to fuck the people in the ass and convince them that they are the ones doing the fucking? See how it removes all responsible from those responsible as if they don't even exist? That is some goddamn magic right there. Rinse and repeat. Government enforcers do not police your community looking for bad guys. They don't prevent crime, and they rarely solve crime. How childishly absurd and irresponsible to even suggest that cops keep you safe. When has a cop ever prevented a crime? It's impossible. It's impossible for anyone to prevent a crime. When a criminal decides to act, the crime is in progress already, so unless the cops can read minds, they can't do anything more than anyone else except react to the crime. And when seconds count, the cops are only minutes away. The Supreme Court has also ruled more than once that the police have absolutely no obligation to respond to a 911 call. Probably why the private security industry is a $1 billion a year industry, equipping people's homes and businesses with security systems, motion sensor floodlights, video cameras, privacy fences, car alarms, security guards, and various types of weapons. Probably why people organize their own neighborhood watch programs and house sit for one another. So what in God's name do the law enforcers do? What they do is prey on peaceful, innocent people, extorting money from them by enforcing the government's laws, period. They engage in a daily legalized crime wave, and if at any point you don't obey their orders, they will escalate the situation to the point of arresting you. and if you resist being arrested for not licking their jackboots, then they'll use deadly force against you to get you to comply. You will submit and obey, even if it kills you. After all, it's for your own good. This is the price you pay for a civilized society. I don't think civilized means what they think it means. Where does such anger and indignation come from in the government's enforcers? Such animosity towards society that they are willing to beat, tase, and even shoot people who pose no threat to them whatsoever? They don't know the people they beat and tase and shoot, so it can't be personal. You see, the law occupies a place of divine righteousness in their minds greater than humanity itself. To disobey them is to disrespect all that they hold sacred and true. So acts of physical violence against the infidels, i.e., domestic terrorism, is warranted to defend their belief system. The proletariat is not above the law, and they will learn their place or suffer the consequences. This lack of decency and humanity is clearly a psychological disorder. Anyone else behaving in such an unstable manner would be considered in need of help, and yet the enforcers are given guns and tasers and clubs and told to enforce the law. They should be institutionalized, not roaming the streets like wild animals. But they're not institutionalized because sure, there are a few bad cops, but the overwhelming majority are good cops, right? Well, no. Law enforcers are expected to enforce the law without prejudice, compassion, or examination of the justness or morality of it. If there is a bench warrant out for the soccer mom with her 2 kids in the car because she didn't make it to court for an expired tag, you arrest her, put her in a cage, take custody of her kids, tow her car, and she has to pay thousands of dollars to get her car and kids and go home again. No decent or honorable person would do such a thing. This doesn't address quotas, warrantless searches, stop and frisk, and the other hundreds of laws that law enforcers enforce that violate the most basic of human rights. This doesn't account for the police unions who have their own Bill of Rights for law enforcers that provides them special treatment when they are charged with crimes unlike how everyone else is treated. This doesn't account for the law enforcers breaking the law with impunity. Speeding through school zones, driving without a seat belt, parking in no parking zones, talking on their cell phones, driving after drinking, etc. No decent or honorable person would do such things. Then they excuse their actions with the Nuremberg defense, "We're just doing our job, therefore they don't have to hold themselves responsible for what they do." They blame it on the law. It must be like an out-of-body experience. Kind of absurd, and all part of the illusion to make the case that the overwhelming majority of cops are good. I don't think good means what they thinks it means. Rinse and repeat. Take the enforcers out of the equation and the law and the politicians and the government are all exposed for the illusion that they are. The entire institution falls apart and evaporates. Politicians can write all the laws they want, but without their enforcers they're worthless and meaningless. Words on a piece of paper that nobody would obey. It's the enforcers that are the heart and backbone of the government and literally give the politicians laws teeth. All government protests are actually law enforcement protests. Protesting the kind of people who wear masks and riot gear paid for with money stolen from the people while standing behind shields and spraying those same people with mace. They are nothing but trained goons, useful idiots, programmable tools for a paycheck. No such thing as a good cop. I think it's amazing that in this day and age of access to information someone would even dare to suggest that law enforcers serve society and serve with honor. That's got to be a topic for some psych student's dissertation, considering no other profession has its own Wikipedia page outlining its current and historical record of brutality against people going back to 1872. You know there's a reason that law enforcers have the universal reputation of being pigs. I don't think protect and serve means what they think it means. The justice system. I believe that while all human life is sacred, there's nothing wrong with the death penalty if you can trust the legal system implicitly, and that no one but a moron would ever trust the legal system. Neil Gaiman. All rise as the honorable judge enters the court, dressed in an imposing black robe, and ascends to a position of superiority behind an ominous desk above everyone else in the room. A large government seal illuminated on the wall behind him to create a sense of divinity. Armed guards posted strategically around the room. Flags and pictures of other distinguished, honorable people past and present adorn the walls. It's an intimidation technique used to get and keep people off balance. To create a sense of superiority over them so they'll be obedient little participants in the state's dog and pony show. But why is he honorable? Why should we honor him? Honor is earned, not bestowed. We don't even know him. Is he honorable? Has he earned it? Judges are either elected or appointed from what I understand. Nothing honorable about that. I don't think honorable means what they think it means. Innocent until proven guilty is the illusion provided to slaves by their masters to give the slaves hope. As if guilt or innocence is something determined by the state. Someone is either innocent of a crime or they are guilty of the crime. That doesn't change based on the judgment of someone's justice system. With such a system, guilty people will be judged innocent and innocent people will be judged guilty, and everyone's soul will be lost. In a free society there are no laws or justice system. Nobody has any authority to arrest and judge a suspect of their choosing after the fact. Justice is served between the criminal and the victim. Then everyone knows who is innocent and who is guilty. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is the state's standard for proving people guilty and imprisoning them. But what is a reasonable doubt? Ask 100 people and get 100 different answers. I have reasonable doubt that reasonable doubt is a valid standard. Pretty fucking ambiguous when people's lives hang in the balance. A reasonable doubt does not prove anything. It just means some arbitrary people think it might be true, whether it is or not. There are only ever two people who will ever know the truth about a crime, the victim and the criminal. All the rest is an educated guess at best and some judge's opinion at worst. How many people have been wrongly imprisoned over the centuries based on proof beyond a reasonable doubt? How many lives ruined? How many have been wrongly executed based on the arbitrary conclusions of proof beyond a reasonable doubt? How does such a justice system make amends for such things? How does it find absolution? Does it care? I have reasonable doubt that the justice system has anything to do with justice. And when you enter a courtroom, everyone works for the government except you. What could go wrong? The judge, the court reporter, the guards, the bailiff, the prosecutor, even your lawyer. His first obligation is to the bar association that licensed him, not to you. If he gets disbarred by caring more about the truth and real justice than the state's justice system, then he can't work. He's not going to risk that. First sign of trouble and he'll throw you under the bus faster than a dead chicken. Even the jury of your peers is bound by the state's rules. What is a jury of your peers? How are they peers? There is no explanation of this. Because they are human beings too? Other than that, what is it about these arbitrary people that makes them peers? They don't know anything about the accused, they know nothing about their background, their education, family, work, interests, nothing. How can they be declared to be peers? Is an 18-year-old unemployed man the peer of the 50-year-old surgeon? Is the school teacher a peer of the stripper? Is a professional athlete the peer of a pilot? The disparity between people in society is enormous to so arbitrarily consider everybody peers. Nor do the lawyers care about such disparities. They're looking for jurors that they believe can best help their client regardless of the truth. Characteristics that have little to do with the legal accusations like race, gender, prejudices, income, etc. I don't think peer means what they think it means. As a juror in the government's courts, you are not allowed to examine the morality of their rules. Even if you think the rules are immoral, even if you think the person on trial did nothing wrong, you must consider only if they disobeyed the rules, and if so, then you must find him guilty. The state has already made the rules and they didn't need your input when they made them, and they don't need it now. But what are you really finding him guilty of? A crime? Not necessarily. The crime is the incarceration of an innocent man who has done nothing wrong. As a juror, you are compelled to abandon your morality and betray your conscience and judge someone based only from within the constraints the state gives you. The state destroys everything it touches, including the moral fabric of a society. And they call it the justice system. I don't think justice means what they think it means. Many verdicts are based on common law. Common law is the idea that past injustices by the justice system, codified into law, provide precedents for those injustices and therefore justify current injustices by the justice system. Got that shit? Since they fucked up in the past, they must continue to fuck up in order to be fair. After all, isn't that what justice is all about? Rinse and repeat. Money and banks. Give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes its laws. Mayer Amschel Rothschild. Most people believe that they understand how a bank works. They believe that banks take in deposits from customers and in return the bank keeps their money safe and pays them some amount of interest. The bank then takes those deposits and loans them out to borrowers at an interest rate higher than what they pay their depositors. The difference then is the bank's profit, right? It's understandable that so many people would believe this since it seems to be reasonable and makes perfect sense, which is what makes it such a good racket. The banking industry is the biggest lie after democracy ever perpetrated on society. It's a Ponzi scheme of epic proportions created by the central banks of the world. The Federal Reserve in the US, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund among many, many others. In the 18th and 19th centuries, banks took gold and silver deposits from customers and provided them with a receipt for their deposits. Then, rather than having to go to the bank and withdraw their gold or silver to buy things, people just used the receipts instead. Easier to carry around and more convenient. These receipts were a medium of exchange that facilitated trade and lowered the transactions costs of doing business for everyone. The paper the receipts were written on had little to no value in themselves. The value was in the gold and silver that the receipts represented, the real asset they were backed by. So although they were physically trading pieces of paper, they were practically trading gold and silver. This was paper money and it was called a gold or silver note depending on what it was backed by. But money being backed by real assets was a problem for the government since, like a housewife put on a budget by her husband, it constrained their spending. It constrained their ability to borrow and tax. They couldn't spend like a drunken schoolgirl with daddy's credit card, so they needed a solution. They needed to unshackle themselves somehow from this insidious gold and silver constraint and free up the money supply to meet their unbridled political tastes and whims. You can't wage perpetual war and build an empire if you don't have access to the money to pay for it. There are weapons to make, soldiers to train, war machines to build, and foreign politicians to bribe and influence. That shit don't come cheap, and credit cards didn't exist yet, so they decided to create their own private source of credit that would eventually plunge the US and the world into perpetual debt and economic servitude, the Federal Reserve Bank. In 1910, 6 men, Nelson Aldrich, A. Piatt Andrew, Henry Davison, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, and Paul Warburg, legislators and some of the wealthiest bankers in the country, met in secret at Jekyll Island, Georgia, to draft a bill for Congress to pass, "Do you see who really controls Congress?" giving all monetary authority to a central bank run by private bankers. Although this central bank is called the Federal Reserve, there's nothing federal about it. It's not a government agency, it's all just part of the illusion. Once again, the clever use of language to create the reality they want you to see. It's a fully private bank that has been given the legal privilege of controlling the nation's money supply and artificially manipulating and fixing interest rates. The Fed enjoys a monopoly on money and interest, answers to no one, not even Congress. They cannot be audited, inspected, or regulated. They do absolutely anything they want with impunity. The Federal Reserve was officially created by Congress in 1913 without constitutional authority, so much for the Constitution constraining Congress, and without the knowledge of most Americans. The bill had already passed the House and was voted on by the Senate late on December 23 when the majority of the Senate was home on Christmas break. But since no official recess had been called, the only 3 members present voted unanimously to pass the bill. President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law, creating the creature from Jekyll Island as coined by G. Edward Griffin in his book of the same title. Isn't democracy grand? Most people erroneously believe that the government makes the money, which is true only in so much as the Treasury prints the physical dollar bills and the U.S. Mint makes the coins. But those are just proxies, tokens, physical representations for money not deposited in a bank somewhere and represent a small percentage of all money in circulation. Since the creation of the Fed has had a monopoly on actually creating money, which is actually just a ledger entry, and the paper token is called a Federal Reserve Note, FRN. Look at any dollar bill and you'll see it written towards the bottom. The paper money is no longer a gold or silver note because there is no gold or silver backing the pieces of paper anymore. They are just pieces of rag paper with green ink and pictures of dead presidents, which are backed by absolutely nothing but the faith that someone else will accept it in trade. Such money is called fiat money because its origins are not market-based money backed by real assets as was the case with gold and silver notes, but rather a governing body simply declared it to be money and enacted legal tender laws to enforce their decree. It's against their laws to refuse Federal Reserve notes as payment, so people have faith that they will be accepted thanks to the backing of the force of government. Take those laws away and the only value of fiat money is to wipe your ass or start a campfire. But if FRNs don't have to be backed by any kind of real asset, if it's not a receipt for a real asset, if it can't be redeemed for a real asset, then what is it? Where does it come from? It comes from thin air. It's counterfeit money created as if by the hand of God, miraculously appearing out of nowhere and entered into the bankers' ledgers. The Fed has the authorization to literally create money from nothing, counterfeit. Now you know why counterfeiting is against the law. The Fed doesn't want the competition. They don't want anyone challenging their monopoly on counterfeiting and the power and control their counterfeit ring provides them. Which means if you can produce a piece of paper that looks enough like the fiat note that someone believes is from the Treasury and fits into their belief system, then you've created just as much wealth as the Fed. You don't need to have any real assets backing it. You don't have to worry about someone coming to redeem it for gold or silver you don't have, so you can make as many as you want. There is no difference in value between the one you make and the ones the Treasury makes if people accept them, because it's all just a belief, a hope, an illusion. It's not real. The real currency is faith, almost fucking religious, isn't it? The value of precious metals doesn't come from their use as money or a belief. They have widespread value even if nobody used them as money, that's why they are used as money. It's not a belief that someone will accept gold or silver in trade, it's a fact despite legal tender laws, not because of them as is the case with FRNs. So if what the Fed does is counterfeiting, how does it launder the newly created money? It can't just add it to its current account, the books wouldn't balance. They launder it by loaning it out to anyone it wants, banks, other central banks, corporations, state governments, the federal government, and foreign governments. It is not constrained by anything or anyone, it can and does create new money at will. Such a debt system of money laundering is effective because the counterfeit money goes out and comes back clean in the accounting ledgers. Clean in the sense that the interest income is justified and accounted for in the ledgers via financial transactions. The implications of this system are clear, namely that all money in circulation is debt. Meaning that every dollar is money borrowed by someone which needs to be paid back with interest. But if all money is debt, where does the money to pay the interest come from? More debt. It's a counterfeit monetary system of perpetual debt. If there were no debt, there'd be no money in circulation, so the bankers have to keep the debt going, they have to keep people borrowing, they have to keep the juice flowing. Ever wonder why when you were a senior in college you received all those pre-approved credit card applications from banks even though you hadn't graduated yet, had no job prospects and didn't expect to have any anytime soon with your sociology degree? Ever wonder how the banks could be so careless and risk their depositors' money on an unemployed college kid? Well, they didn't. They were offering to loan you new counterfeit money that would be created on the spot every time you swiped your card. No need for deposits when you can fabricate it out of thin air as needed. That's how credit cards work. There is no account of money with the card owner's name on it that sits in the bank waiting to be spent. Every time someone uses a credit card, brand new money is created by the bank that must be laundered, paid back with interest. That's why credit cards have become so prevalent in society and so easy to get and use. They facilitate the debt process that creates money for the banking system. Normally, borrowing money is something you do when you don't have enough money to meet your needs. It's a measure of last resort, and there was a time when it was seen as shameful if you were so financially irresponsible that you had to ask the bank for a loan. It's not something you should do to pay for a Big Mac at McDonald's. But for decades the financial industry has engaged in their own social engineering campaign that has turned being in debt into a virtue and is even considered a status symbol. Convincing consumers that borrowing often, even when not necessary, and paying it back is the sign of financial responsibility. That their credit cards represent financial freedom and success rather than the shackles that they are. They offer a gold card, a platinum card, giving debt the illusion of wealth and stature. The VIP card for the really big debtors to impress the girls and get laid, because being in debt is sexy but being a VIP debtor is hot. Most stores and other point of sales accept credit card payments, making it easy and convenient to pay for almost anything. The easier it is to pay, even if it means taking a bank loan to pay for dinner and a movie, the more people will borrow and go further into debt. If you don't have the money to pay for dinner and a movie for you and your girl, you shouldn't be dating. And like any religious faith, there has to be a way to shame people who sin in order to control them, so they've created the credit score. A meaningless number for consumers to mindlessly worry about, even though nobody knows how it's calculated, and any business or bank can make a report to a credit agency for anything whether it's valid or not, and the consumer has to refute it lest his credit score gets too low and embarrasses him. People actually brag about their credit score at parties and in casual conversation like it matters. The system is set up such that if you don't borrow and spend, then your credit score is just as bad as if you did borrow and spend and didn't pay it back. Did you get that? If you are financially responsible and live within your means, your credit score will be just as bad as someone who's financially irresponsible and lives beyond his means. Experience shows that those with the highest credit scores are those who have been in perpetual debt, borrowing increasingly larger amounts and paying it all back religiously with interest. Pretty slick, huh? Works like a charm on the useful idiots. The truth is that, contrary to popular myth, your high school civics class, and what your parents told you, deposits are not used to make loans. Banks do not need other people's money, loans create deposits. Sounds exactly the opposite of what you always believed, right? Isn't everything? The counterfeit nature of central banks around the world is public knowledge. Nobody refutes it, they just keep it to themselves, and when challenged they keep the explanation as muddled as possible. Alan Holmes, a former senior vice president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, wrote in 1969, "In the real world, banks extend credit, creating deposits in the process, and look for the reserves later." Vitor Constancio, vice president of the European Central Bank, ECB, in a speech given in December 2011, argued, "In reality the sequence works more in the opposite direction, with banks taking first their credit decisions and then looking for the necessary funding and reserves of central bank money. Depositors' money is only used to meet the reserve requirement of the loans they've made. Legally, banks need to keep money on hand to meet the needs of the checks and debit card payments their customers make. So if the reserve requirement is 10% and the bank creates $100,000 in new money to make a loan, then they must have at least $10,000 in reserves, so they try to attract new depositors to meet the reserve requirement. In practice, these reserves serve no purpose except to meet legal requirements and a place for people to put their money to facilitate payments. They have nothing to do with how much a bank can loan out, except in as much as they need to legally meet the reserve requirement, but there are ways around that as well. They can borrow from other banks, they can borrow directly from the Fed, or they can just ignore it altogether because, so what? They control the politicians, not the other way around. This is exactly the kind of open-ended monetary system the government wanted when they created the Fed. The bankers get rich by keeping society in debt and controlling them with that debt, and the politicians have an unlimited well of money available to borrow and spend to finance their empires. It also allows the government to increase taxation since people can pay taxes with their credit cards. Voila! See the whole circle now? Economically, this debt-based monetary system of counterfeit money systematically destroys the currency and the economy from the inside out. As the Fed creates more and more new money, the value of each existing dollar decreases. This is inflation. The inflated money supply then leads to rising prices for everyone, which is an inflation tax imposed on society by the Fed. This tax continues to grow with the money supply until a currency crisis ensues and the money is worthless, leading to economic collapse. Historically, this has happened many times when governments printed paper money writ large to finance war, empire, and their own wealth. The Founding Fathers printed the Continental Dollar into oblivion to finance their military coup in 1776. The Weimar Republic in Germany did the same with the Deutschmark to finance WWI, as did the Communists to finance their workers' paradise, and Venezuela is doing so now to prop up their socialist utopia that's falling apart. Rinse and repeat. The entire economy is built on an illusion of wealth. More concerning is how many other countries use the US dollar as their principal form of currency or as a reserve currency, meaning that their economies are built on that same illusion, and when the US dollar collapses, so will a lot of the world's economies, plunging mankind into an economic dark age. So in an effort to maintain the illusion, the politicians have to engage in a constant media campaign extolling the wealth of the nation. That the US is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but in reality, economically, the US is one of the poorest. Wealth isn't created from a printing press. The government owes $21 trillion in debt with another $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Consumers are another $4 trillion in debt with another $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. The US doesn't produce anything of any quality, so it has to import it, so the trade deficit is $500 billion/year. Poverty, illiteracy, obesity, drug addiction, crumbling infrastructure, violent crime, perpetual war, devaluing dollar. Over 50% of Americans now receive some form of assistance from the state. I don't think wealthy means what people think it means. Rinse and repeat. The national debt. Blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt. Herbert Hoover. National debt? How do they figure it's the nation's debt? There's no such person as the nation, and none of us real people borrowed or spent a penny of that shit. It ain't our debt, it's the politicians' debt. Let the politicians pay it back. Can you imagine the reaction if you had your credit card bill sent to your neighbor every month? Absurd, right? But perfectly normal on the other side of the political looking glass. The state gets the central bank to whip up some counterfeit money, loan it to them to spend on anything they decide, and then they tax the working class to pay it back, with interest. It's for your own benefit, national security, and the children, of course. You should be proud to pay for it. If you're not shaking your head in disbelief, you should be. Government bonds are the instruments through which the state borrows money to fund their empire and welfare state. Someone buys a bond and the government promises to pay the face value of the bond in 10 years plus an effective rate of interest. These bonds are considered a risk-free investment, believe it or not, even though they are backed by an organization that produces nothing. An organization that has no wealth of its own, they're scavengers constantly on the take looking for another source of income. Their only means of paying this debt back is to take money from those who do produce via taxation or to borrow more money. Debt to pay debt, what could go wrong? The only assurance anyone has that their investment in a government bond will be paid back is the force of government. That government being government has the resources to do anything and everything it wants regardless how morally or economically destructive. Possibly even using the existing borrowed money to invade, occupy, and confiscate the oil and wealth of other nations. Just spitballing here. These bonds are also an essential part of the central banking system. You knew there had to be a connection between the Fed and the Gov, right? The Fed artificially manipulating and fixing interest rates by creating new money and buying government bonds. There's an inverse relationship between the price of a government bond and the effective interest paid on it. As demand for bonds goes up, the price of the bonds is driven up, the effective interest goes down and vice versa. The interest rate on government bonds is used as the basis for all other interest rates charged by banks, since at worst the banks could just loan the government money, so if they are going to loan it to anyone else, the interest rate they charge will be at least the rate they could get on government bonds. But there's a catch: this new money created out of thin air by the Fed increases the supply of money in circulation, thus devaluing the dollar. This sort of monetary policy is meant to stimulate economic activity. Lower interest rates typically motivate people to borrow and invest, thereby creating even more new money by the banks and leaving those investors holding the bag for the bonds as well. How about that double whammy? Bet you didn't see that coming? For almost 2 decades now, the Fed has tried to hold interest rates between 0.25% and 0%. They created over $4 trillion in new money in an attempt to do so. Like any economic good, the price reflects the market value of the good, and money is no different. The interest is the price of money as determined by supply and demand. Federal Reserve notes, though, are not real economic goods, they are artificial economic goods, meaning their supply is artificially manipulated by the Fed and not determined by the market. The Fed decides at any point in time how much money is in circulation in order to manipulate interest rates. And like any economic good, a price of zero indicates it's worthless in the market. Essentially, the Fed must destroy the value of the currency in order to drive interest rates down in an attempt to stimulate economic activity. But even if successful, inflation will be so high it'll be 1 step forward, 2 steps backward for economic growth. It's a vicious financial circle that eats itself in the end, and dinner is almost over. The government and its financial experts will brag that the government debt doesn't matter, that the government can borrow and spend as much as it wants because it can always just borrow more to pay back existing debt, which is exactly the current situation. The current $21 trillion in government debt is untenable, it will never be paid back in full. It's a mathematical impossibility. The government must borrow trillions every year just to make their payments with interest. This debt has crossed the inflection point and is now feeding on itself, and will continue to do so until it explodes, creating a currency crisis. The experts also perpetuate the economic myth that the government will never default on their debt, but what difference does it make if they default outright and refuse to pay it, or if they pay it but the currency is worthless? Great. You have a bunch of government bonds that you can cash in at any time, but the money you get has been devalued to the point the bonds would be more valuable as kindling for a fire on a cold winter night. It's still a default, you still lose your wealth and purchasing power. So the magic show goes from the Fed buying government bonds by inflating the money supply in order to manipulate interest rates, in an attempt to stimulate the economy, which devalues the currency, which causes higher prices, which stifles economic activity, thereby prompting the Fed to buy more bonds, by inflating the money supply, rinse and repeat. This, my friends, is how you create a third world country. War. In war, truth is the first casualty. Aeschylus. No such thing as a good war or a just war or a great war. War is not romantic, cool, badass, interesting, or worthy of reenacting. War reenactors are pathetic, historical jock sniffers. All war throughout history has been nothing more than a pissing match between government psychopaths attempting to gain control, power, and wealth regardless how many innocent people had to be sacrificed, period. War is old men sending young men off to die, period. Young men are trained to be killers and paid to do so, they are professional killers by definition. Anybody telling you anything different is full of shit up to their ears and trying to hide their agenda. Premeditatively killing someone is murder regardless why you do it. Every soldier who ever attacked and killed someone because the government ordered them to is a murderer. That's what murder is regardless of government doublespeak. Your grandfather in World War II, your uncle in Korea, your dad in Vietnam, your cousin in Iraq, and your brother in Syria. The Japanese pilots who bombed Pearl Harbor and the men aboard the planes that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. The drone pilots dropping bombs in Pakistan and Yemen from halfway around the world and the clandestine CIA assassins. The list goes on. All murderers by definition, not by opinion. Killing people on behalf of the military doesn't absolve you of your crimes, doesn't justify your actions, doesn't cleanse your soul of its guilt regardless what the military will tell you. You are not a hero, you weren't brave, you weren't willing to write a check up to and including your life for your country. You are a murderer and you will be a murderer for the rest of your life. Live with that shit. Guilty of the most heinous crime any human being can perpetrate on another, killing innocent men, women, and children. People they didn't even know and who couldn't have possibly posed a threat to them or anybody else. The soldiers who actually believe the brainwashing and religious patriotic rhetoric, the true believers, they're the lucky ones. They don't feel the guilt and shame that any sane human being would feel. It's the ones that realize what they've done that suffer. The shame and guilt they feel after they've freed their minds of the illusion of patriotism, nationalism, and government authority. After they've seen through the lies of the military brainwashing and wake up one morning back in reality and realize they can never unsee what they've seen and they can never undo what they've done and they'll never get their legs back. On average, 21 veterans commit suicide every day, twice the national average. I wonder why. They try to cope with their conscience and memories and physical handicaps by drinking, using drugs, fucking anything that moves, anything to numb the pain, fill the hole in their soul, and try to forget. They try to escape to an alternative reality where they are whole and aren't murderers anymore, where they can't hear the screams or see the faces of the people they killed. A place where the bomb that hit their Humvee never exploded. Easier said than done. What happened? Where did it all go so wrong? Where's that bright-eyed, bushy-tailed high school kid who played on the baseball team, hung out in the McDonald's parking lot on Friday nights, and took his sweetheart to senior prom? What happened to their college plans and aspirations for the future? How did he end up homeless under a bridge, unable to walk, unable to sleep, and thinking of nothing but how to get his next fix? It all seems so far away now, like it was all just a dream and never really happened. It all seemed to start when that Marine gunnery sergeant came to visit his class on senior career day. That's the last time he remembers feeling normal. After that it's all a blur. It's embarrassing to see the veterans on Sunday morning at the IHOP all decked out in their USS Eisenhower ball cap adorned from front to back with pins representing some sort of military recognition. Their pathetic yellow windbreakers with patches all over it commemorating their service. As if this is their defining accomplishment in life, their pride and joy, their military service. Who did they serve? How does war serve anyone, especially when your government starts it? I don't think service means what they think it means. And what is there to be proud of? You were conscripted, forced to go or else, and you went to kill people because you were more afraid of what your own government would do to you if you refused than you were of possibly being killed on the battlefield. At least on the battlefield you stood a chance. Sound familiar? Rinse and repeat. It's not normal for one human being to kill another. It goes against the essence of our humanity and our conscience. Combat veterans are responsible for almost 21% of domestic violence nationwide, and veterans alone account for 20% of all U.S. suicides. Rinse and repeat in the blood of patriots and kids who aren't old enough to drink a beer legally but are given deadly weapons and told to go kill without question, prejudice, or compassion. Not surprising that so many veterans become law enforcement, is it? Businesses. The most important single central fact about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit. Milton Friedman. We're conditioned by the media and the state and other purveyors of misinformation to believe that businesses are selfish entities motivated only by profit and greed at the expense of their fellow man, especially the poor. And since such individuals cannot be trusted to do what's right, the state must intervene and redistribute wealth and resources more fairly, whatever the state decides that is. But like everything down the psychological rabbit hole, it's exactly the opposite from reality. Every decision any rational person makes is for personal benefit, profit of some kind. If it were not, then that person would be a self-destructive person sticking his hand in an open flame and flushing money down the toilet. If you work, then you profit from your decision to work. If you buy a house, then you benefit from your decision to have shelter. If you take a vacation, then you benefit from fun in the sun. Even giving a poor person money is for personal benefit because you feel good about helping someone. The agenda for everyone always is profit, personal benefit in one way or another. The profit motive for businesses is no different than that of the individual. Markets demand that businesses understand what people need and want. The business's concern for the needs and wants of society must come first and foremost. They must produce what the public demands or else fail and risk making no profit at all. If a business produces a thing called a widget and nobody needs or wants a widget, then nobody will buy it, the business will make no money, and it will go out of business, so they must serve the public need. And not only serve the public need but be able to do it as efficiently as possible at a price consumers can afford. Wasting resources benefits no one and drives prices up, making it more difficult to sell. Free markets are voluntary, moral, efficient, and fair. Everybody can find anything they want and need from businesses. All of our essential needs in life come from businesses: cars, food, clothing, housing, medical care, and all of our most important wants: computers, cell phones, cigarettes, alcohol, and holidays. Businesses are essential to serving society's greater good. They serve the needs and wants of society at the best price possible and everybody benefits. What's selfish and greedy about that? What's more compassionate and economically prosperous for everyone than that? The selfish and greedy businesses are the ones with the politicians in their back pocket. Those businesses can produce a widget that nobody needs or wants and still profit handsomely. Only with government influence can a business be selfish and greedy and steal their wealth rather than earn it. It's perfectly legal for people to bribe politicians to redistribute wealth to their business in order to subsidize its failure. The green energy industry has received hundreds of millions of dollars of government subsidies and loans over the years as one company after another has failed, gone bankrupt and taken its government subsidies with it. Although the word green makes people feel psychologically warm and fuzzy and socially responsible inside, these companies produced nothing of any benefit to society whatsoever. They served no one but themselves at the expense of society. It is government force, it's immoral, inefficient, and unjust. Those who are emotional about the issue complain that since profit is the motive, the ends are irrelevant. It's just evil without any further examination and regardless how much it benefits society. As if it's not enough that the profit motive incentivizes business to provide for society's needs at a price they can afford, it's got to be done for the right reasons, the reasons they feel it should be done, otherwise it's just wrong. Better people go without than have their needs provided for by a profit-motivated business. But somehow, if government whose motive is nothing but money, power, and control takes control of the market and robs Peter to pay for shitty, inflated products for Paul, then that's better since they want to believe that the government's motives are benevolent and kind. Better we're all equally poor and in need than everyone having their needs and wants fulfilled while some are unequally wealthy. Rinse and repeat. Government regulations. Virtue is more to be feared than vice, because its excesses are not subject to the regulation of conscience. Adam Smith. Companies can't be trusted, so they have to be regulated by the government, right? If left unchecked, evil, greedy businesses will put employees and consumers in danger and cheat them out of their money. Okay, so who should regulate them? Who understands those industries well enough to know what needs to be regulated and how? Who better than the experts from those industries, right? People from those industries that can't be trusted. Wait, what? Lobbying is the term used in Washington, D.C. for legalized bribery. Lobbyists, typically the scum of the earth, or lawyers, whichever, wine and dine the regulatory officials with fine restaurants, parties with pretty girls, vacation junkets, contributions to their foundation, and whatever else they can to buy the politicians' loyalty. Then the lobbyists write the regulatory bills that they want passed into law, which typically give them a competitive advantage or redistributes wealth to them directly. The politicians then get the bills passed in Congress and signed into law. How's that democratic republic working out for you? After a number of years as a government regulatory official, politicians then go to work for the industries they regulated. Who better to know who and how to bribe those in Washington than those from Washington that they used to bribe? It's called the revolving door when people continuously circle between industry and government regulatory positions. It's just another government racket resulting in less freedom, higher prices, and millions for those industries and the politicians. The politicians make millions, the industries make billions, and the people are told that they are safer for it. Ever wonder how it is that over half the members of Congress are millionaires and became so since joining Congress? But since industry has the politicians in their back pockets, there's no real regulation of any consequence going on, it's all just a well-conceived con. Whenever something happens that causes harm to an employee or a consumer, even though there were already thousands of regulatory statutes, the politicians don't blame it on their lying, conniving maleficence but rather on insufficient regulation, so the solution is more regulation. The answer to government failure is always more government. I don't think regulation means what they think it means. Rinse and repeat. Conclusion. When people say that if you don't like it here then you can leave, what they are really saying is that they don't want you challenging their religious belief in nationalism and government authority. Either you blindly love your country because you were randomly born there, or get the hell out. They don't want a bunch of critical thinkers infecting their society with reason, rational thought, logic, common sense, and conscience. The government is an institution consisting of a president, 535 members of a Congress and 9 Supreme Court justices. Those 545 people who make up this institution do not defend the nation, build roads, provide education, keep you safe, or any of the other myths. The other 320 million people do all that. The same people who would do it if those 545 didn't exist. The government doesn't do shit. This unquestionable belief in all the things the government does is a religious belief for which there is absolutely no evidence. The people do everything. They have to, who else is going to do it? All the government does is make what they do more expensive, more difficult, more dangerous, and they take the product of their work. The government wages wars, sends those people to die while sitting comfortably at home. Those wars create poverty, famine, and suffering. Regardless what you call it, if man creates a system of governance and laws, then it's already unjust, immoral, and economically destructive. No individual or even group of individuals can engineer how society should behave and live. It has always and will always result in the engineers having men with guns, the law enforcers enforcing their will. Regardless of how smart people are, constitutions and their laws are just words on a piece of paper. Those words have no authority and certainly no power to constrain the actions of wicked men. The romantic idea of an American republic was doomed from the start. The truth that nobody wants to face is that if we as a society cannot live peacefully and productively with one another, then we are the problem, and no amount of government or a constitution or laws or nationalism will make us better people. Rinse and repeat.